Okay, so I'll kind of just describe. So I talked about all the stuff that happened with the shoot away, all that. Now I'll kind of describe the way my orientation my whole life. So I'll give an example. I was playing with the P. Miller Ballers. This was Master P's basketball team. This was at the time when the shoot away had messed up my shot, but I was still a good player because my dribbling was great. Everything else was great, but my shot got messed up because of the shoot away machine. But I was playing with the P. Miller Ballers. Master P was on the team. A lot of NBA players, including Brandon Jennings, DeMar DeRozan, were on the team. We're the best team in the country playing in Las Vegas. And I remember I was with all the black guys, and all the black guys, they're rolling the dice and playing their, gambling and shit and doing, these are my teammates. And, I'm there, and then one of the kids is like, yo, was Jesus white or was he black? And then the Mexican guy was like, there was one Mexican guy on our team. He was like a 7-foot Mexican guy. And he was like, Jesus wasn't black or white, yo. He was Mexican, he was brown. And then the black guys were like, no, Jesus was black. But then one of the black guys was like, no, Jesus was white, because this black guy, he was more of a he was always like that. He was always kind of like more pro-white. And then one of the guys asked me, because I remember some girls walked in first, and the girls were like, and the black guys were all like, there's these two white girls, and black guys were like, hey, no shirts allowed in this room and stuff. They were trying to hit on them. But then the white girls looked at me and they were like, hey, he's cute. Like they're looking at me like he's cute, because I always had fan clubs of girls, and I'm not gonna get into reasons because of swag flow, but I always had fan clubs of girls. But the girls were like, he's cute and stuff, and they're talking about me. And then after they left, all the black guys were like, Ryan, those girls were hot, like, and they were saying you were cute. Why didn't you hit on them? But I was always shy, and also I always saw it's a long story, but I was never like, even though I had fan clubs of girls, I didn't really capitalize on it, But that's a different story. But I'm not gay though. But that's a different story. But anyway, so the black guys were like, yo, Jesus was black, yo. But then one of the black guys asked me, he was like, hey Ryan, what was Jesus black or was he white? And I was like, Jesus was Jewish. And they were like, what? And I was like, yeah, Jesus is Jewish. He's like me. I said, I'm Jewish. That's what Jesus was like. He looked like me. Because so now this was the thing though. My whole life, I loved race mixing. Like whenever I would see a black person with a white person, I loved it. I thought it was awesome. Whenever I would see like a mixed race person, I loved it. And this is true. So like when I would look at the people on like these websites where like, Jews want everyone to race mix and they hate white people and stuff. That's the way I was. That's why when I see that stuff now, I'm like, and people are like, oh, those people are white supremacists or evil. I'm like, dude, they're right. That's the way I was. I know they're right because that's the way I was. So for me to be like, oh, they're wrong, I'd be like, that. Then I'm lying. I loved race mixing. I loved, and I loved black people. And I didn't like white people. And I think it was because I saw myself as Jewish. And, maybe it is like a genetic thing, like an innate thing, but I think it's because I saw myself as Jewish. And I didn't like white people because I saw white people as a threat. And I was always a leftist Marxist. I saw white people as the biggest threat. So I just loved anything black. But I remember they asked me, like, Ryan, was Jesus? So I have to look at it. I have to analyze my subconscious at this time. Now, my grandpa would say I just was expressing dualistic software. I was still attached to my ego identity, and therefore I was not in the flow, because when you're attached to the ego identity, at the time I didn't understand it. Now I understand what my grandpa was saying. But if you're attached to your ego identity, it distorts your perception, it distorts your belief, and then you cannot be in the flow, which is the truth. You can't see things the way they really are. But at that time, yes, I was attached to my ego identity. So I saw myself as Jewish, and I was anti-white, and I loved race mixing. And I loved black people, and I loved anything degenerate, I think. So when the white people are like, the white supremacists are like, Jews, they promote degeneracy, I'm like, dude, I was that way. They're not lying. That's the way I was. So I'm like, that's the way I was. So, but this is an interesting thing. I have to analyze my subconscious. So my friends asked me, was Jesus black or white? And I'm like, he's Jewish. He's like me. He looked like me. Now, I always saw Jews as more black. And that's part of the reason why I liked people of color more. So like when I would talk to people of color, I would imagine myself as a person of color, even though quote unquote people say I'm white. I would see myself as Jewish, and I see myself as a person of color, so I'd get along well with them. And I just imagine myself as a person of color. So because I saw myself as Jewish, and that's the way I saw Jewish people. But when they asked me, was Jesus black or white? I'm like, he's Jewish. So I always liked black people better, and I always wanted race mixing, and I didn't like white people because I think it's because I saw them as threat, because I saw myself as Jewish. But at the same time, though, I also know that really I was a Jewish supremacist. I could tell myself like I was a black supremacist and I wanted black people because I wanted race mixing and I wanted to destroy the white people. But really, deep down, I was a Jewish supremacist. And I think this is the way a lot of Jews are. They act like they really like black people and people of color. And that's the way I was. But really, deep down, it's because they like Jews. And it is a selfish, as my grandpa would say, it's dualistic software, a selfish orientation designated for Jews. So I saw myself as Jewish, so therefore I didn't like white people and I wanted race mixing. Because, you know, I saw white people as the biggest threat. But really, it seemed like I loved black people, and I did love black people. I was hanging out, all my friends were black. I loved everything black. I loved rap music. I loved basketball. I loved everything black. But at the same time, though, I look at it and have to analyze my subconscious. And really, I think it was because I saw myself as Jewish. And really, deep down, I looked down upon black people. Like, because I remember when they were saying, like, well, Jesus was black and stuff. In my mind, I was like, dude, black people are not as smart as Jews. Jews are, in my mind, I'm like, Jews are far superior in every way. I'm like, Jesus wasn't black, dude. And I think that deep down, that's the way I was. But really, I love black people. I didn't like white people, and I was always a leftist. So I'm like, you know, white people aren't smarter than black people. White people are, you know, that's just because of environment and you know, it's just environment. And I was a huge leftist. It's just environment and, you know, privilege. And I was the typical leftist because I wanted white people and black people to mix, and I wanted to make white people be inferior compared to black people. But at the same time, I looked deep down, I was a Jewish supremacist, though. So I have to analyze my subconscious. So that's my orientation. But anyways, back to the story though. So that's the background of my orientation. So, but that's why when my grandpa comes in, and my grandpa's like, Ryan, really what you want? You know, I'm shooting with my dad. My dad messed up my shot. Again, maybe this was my karma since I was anti-white. Maybe this was my karma, you know? But my dad messed up my shot. I'm shooting on shoe it's messed up my shot. So then my grandpa comes in. My grandpa's like, he doesn't know what's going on. He comes in from Kauai. So he comes in, he's like, he sees conflict between me and my dad, and he doesn't know that it's because of the shoot away machine or my shots messed up. He's just like, oh, this is normal conflict between a son and his father. You know, it's a teen rebellion. And that's why there's conflict. It happens all the time. And what Ryan really wants is independence. But that's not what was going on. I didn't really want independence. That wasn't a teen rebellion. It was, we were trying to fix my shot. My dad messed up my shot. It's a complicated story. But so we're trying to fix my shot. And then my grandpa goes, oh, Ryan just wants independence. But again, like I said, the reason why my grandpa was so into independence is because my grandpa was a huge Ayn Rand fan. And he was the opposite of a communist. He was like a Nazi white supremacist, the way I saw him, because he was against welfare. And I remember, because I was a leftist my whole life, when I hear my grandpa's against welfare and all that stuff, I'm like, dude, this guy's a white supremacist Nazi, because I loved welfare. Because really, now again, was it because I was compassionate and I wanted to help the people of color? No, it's because I saw myself as Jewish, I think, and I looked at the people of color and I loved the people of color. Why was it? Because of like my love for the people of color? No, it's because I wanted to defeat the white people, and I think that's the way a lot of Jews are. So I have to be honest with myself. So, you know, and I saw Jews as more people of color, you know, so I loved welfare. I was like, I was a communist. So I'm like, I love degeneracy. I love to see black people acting degenerate and lazy and being thorns to the white race. I loved that. You know, I was a complete leftist. So when my grandpa comes in, my grandpa's like, well, Ryan just wants independence. And, you know, And then I you know, now I know that that's what he's about, because he's like, you know, because he was so into independence, because he's like, you know, welfare is bad. You know, being dependent on people is bad. You want to be independent and work hard and be in the flow and be a part of the anti-entropic reordering function and work hard. So my grandpa's all into working hard. And again, when my grandpa would be like, work hard, be independent, I'm like, that's just white supremacy. You know, this idea of like work hard. But in my mind, I was a communist leftist always. I'm like, why you need to work hard for the white man, for the system? Like, I saw myself as more as a Jew and a person of color, and I was against the whole like white system. So I'm like, work hard. Why do you got to work hard? You know. So I think I have to be honest with myself. Was it because was I a leftist because I'm like, oh, I'm so compassionate. I want to give to the poor people. I want to give to the Mexicans and open the borders. That's the way I was. I loved the idea of open borders, and I hated Christianity. I hated religion because I thought religion divided people, and I wanted everybody to mix, especially the white people. So this is the background though. So was I an innocent? My grandpa would say like there is no innocent victims. Maybe all this terrible stuff happened to me because I was such a dumbass communist. You know, and regardless, it's terrible that I was abused with the shoot away machine and all this stuff. But at the same time, I'm like, maybe it was for the best because maybe this was my karma, you know? But so I was a leftist, but then my grandpa comes in, he's like, well, Ryan really wants his independence. But I will get into, but this made me more into a Marxist because I'm like, I don't want non-independence. I need help from my dad. Now, this is the other thing. My grandpa would be like, you know, like I said, I went to the psychologist with my mom and dad and grandpa, and I tell the psychologist, you know, can we set up a system? Because my dad would shoot with me, and then I would be shooting bad, and my dad would get mad, and he'd be like, I give up, and then he wouldn't shoot with me for 2 weeks. But I felt like I needed my dad, you know. But then sometimes if I was playing good, my dad would shoot with me every single day that week, and it was as I said, capricious. My dad was capricious, and it was abusive, and that uncertainty was very difficult, you know. Sometimes my dad would shoot with me every day. Sometimes he'd be mad at me. Sometimes he's happy with me, you know. And I'm like, it was too capricious. So I told the psychologist, like, let's just have a system where like once a week, my dad will shoot with me for 15 minutes. And then let's just do that. So then I don't have to ask him then, because then I ask him and he says, no, ask me again, I'm gonna beat you up. You know, I didn't want the capriciousness. And sometimes he would help me. And then sometimes I ask him, he'd be like, okay, let's go shoot, you know. But I was just like, let's just set up a system to make things a lot easier, to make things a lot healthier. Where like once a week, 15 minutes, dad because all I needed him was to look at my shot. Because he's the one I didn't know my shot was messed up. He's the one who's telling me, your shot looks ugly, it's terrible. What's wrong with you? I didn't know, my whole life I just shot. I didn't know what I was doing. And I didn't know the shoot away was messing up my shot. So I was just like, you know, it was a bad situation. So I was just like, you know, let's just have 15 minutes a week where I could just shoot with my dad. One day a week. That would make things easy. So then I could just ask my dad, you know, is my shot look really terrible right now? My dad would be able to make little adjustments so my shot didn't look completely terrible, you know? So but then my dad's like, I'm not gonna do that. Cause my dad had problems, dude, and he messed me up, dude. He really messed me up. And I feel bad for him because he thought he was helping me. He thought there was something wrong with me. He didn't know that he was the one who was telling me to do the wrong thing, and he didn't know the shoot away. He didn't realize that he was the problem and the shoot away was a problem. And I feel bad for him, you know? He wanted what was best. And I'm not even mad at him. I'm just like, hey, dude, you know, you tried your hardest. You fucked up, but you tried hard. Let's move on. But sadly, he won't move on. And I'll get to that. But, so that's a tragedy that happened. But then my grandpa comes in. My grandpa's like, Ryan, you know, your dad. My dad's like, I'm not going to do that. So my grandpa's like, Ryan, you just have to accept bad calls. You think that's a bad call. We'll just have to accept it. So this is the other thing that made me more of a Marxist. So I'm like, you know, again, I see my grandpa as a white supremacist, Nazi, fascist. And the way that they are is like, just accept things. You know, if things are bad, if you're being abused and stuff, just accept it. And you know, if your dad makes a bad call, you have to just accept bad calls. But in my mind, I'm like, why don't you tell my dad, hey, stop making bad calls. Listen, stop being so mean. Stop being so terrible. Start treating your son with some compassion. And you know, it was a tragic situation. No matter what, it would have been bad because my dad didn't know the shoot away was a problem and stuff. But regardless, my grandpa could have said, instead of just being on their side and being like, Ryan, you just have to accept bad calls. You could have been like, hey, guys, Paul, you know, you also have to make some adjustments. You can't beat up your son. You can't, you know, Marla, you can't call your son names. You can't be calling him a loser and a piece of shit and all that and being abusive to him. You guys also need yes, Ryan can learn to accept calls a little bit, you know, regardless, it was a terrible situation. The shoot rate was a problem, but yeah, Ryan can learn to accept the bad calls and stuff. Yes, that could be helpful, but also you guys need to make some adjustments as well, you know. But like this made me more of a Marxist. Communist is, I see my grandpa as just like, oh yeah, just accept bad calls. And in my mind, I'm like, yeah, this is just like the white people, you know, they just have, the people of color just have to accept things and blah, you know, so it made me more of a Marxist, you know. But like I said, my whole life I was a Marxist. So, you know, I'm like, but in the Marxism, it's not, you don't accept bad calls, you make changes. You tell the oppressors, hey, stop being oppressors. And that's the way I wanted to be. Like, hey, Dad, I don't need to just accept your bad calls. Why don't you stop making such fucking bad calls? You know, maybe you can for 15 minutes a week just shoot with me and on a set day, and that will make things nicer. But instead, my grandpa set up things where it's like, just accept bad calls. So then my mom and dad, I feel like what ended up happening is then my mom and dad were like, okay, we can be authoritarian assholes. So we'll do whatever we want, and Ryan just has to accept it. And that's what ends up hurting me in the future. Instead of, like I said, my grandpa could have been like, hey, Ryan, yeah, you can learn to accept bad calls and have trust and realize that everything's just fine and, you know, be in the flow and whatever. But also, Marla and Paul, you guys can also learn to be a little bit better parents, you know, and make better calls instead of just making whatever call you want and demanding that Ryan accept it. That's authoritarian parenting. That's not good. But that's what my grandpa, I feel like he condoned. My grandpa, I feel like he made things 1,000 times worse. And I'm going to get to that. So I'll get to that next lecture.